Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war. In 2 seconds, they catapult off carrier decks at 200 miles per hour and soar faster than the speed of sound. Welcome to another day at the office in naval aviation. From the Wright brothers to the right stuff, from Midway to Desert Storm, meet the men and the planes of naval aviation. Next on Brute Force, the history of weapons at war.
When the Wright brothers flew their simple aircraft at Kitty Hawk in 1903, only a few military leaders saw the potential to revolutionize naval warfare by arming ships with these new flying inventions. Today, of course, aircraft carriers form the nucleus of a Navy strike force, and the planes that catapult off their decks are some of the most complex weapons known to man. The journey from those dunes at Kitty Hawk to the sands of the Persian Gulf is a story celebrating the collaboration of imagination and necessity, adventure and discipline, national effort, and individual heroism. It's the story of naval aviation.
I'd like to welcome you all to where the adventure begins. This is the finest flight training program available anywhere in the world. Over the next 14 to 16 weeks, we are going to test you in many ways. Not only academically,
available is thrust available,
but physically, on the cross-country course, in the swimming pool. In fact, there'll be times when you say, how much more of this can I take in this pool? The training that you're about to undergo is going to be very demanding, but it's a training program that's been around for a number of years. All of us that wear wings of gold went through a program just like this.
Navy pilots began earning their wings of gold soon after it was believed the Wright brothers' new flying invention could be useful at sea.
You could put an observer, a pilot, up to 100 feet, 200 feet. You could tremendously increase the horizon, how far you could see. The eyes of the Navy would be lifted above the water.
But while some were enthusiastic about such prospects, most were skeptical.
I got the idea that I wanted to learn to fly, that naval aviation would amount to something for naval purposes. So I put in a request to the Navy Department, and they came back and quite frankly said that they didn't believe aviation would ever amount to anything.
When the US Navy decided that they wanted to take airplanes to sea, they couldn't find a qualified pilot amongst the ranks of naval officers. So they had to turn to a stuntman, Eugene Ely.
In November 1910, Ely flew a plane off a platform built on a Navy cruiser and landed it safely ashore.
A short time later, he landed aboard a battleship moored in San Francisco Bay, had lunch with the captain, they turned the plane around, took off, and that was the beginning of naval aviation.
Impressed with Ely's unique achievements, the Navy appropriated $25,000 for the purchase of its first planes. 3 years later, in 1914, they began training pilots at a remote base in Florida.
Naval aviation, I think, was probably seen as a stepchild. They may even have sent it here. Some folklore says to get rid of it and hope it would go away, but it was, even though very small, did prosper, and they managed to train a small cadre of naval aviators that really made up the core of naval aviation that started in World War I here in Pensacola.
It took World War I to move aviation into the military. At sea, the primary naval aviation role is patrolling against submarines.
Though U.S. Navy flyers assisted in these patrols against German U-boats, American naval aviation still lagged behind the Allies.
We started the war with something like 30 naval aviators and 22 or 3 operational float planes, which was, by anybody's measurement, it's insufficient for any type of combat.
During the war, it was the British who made the big advances in naval aviation.
The world's first true aircraft carrier was HMS Argus, which is a converted British warship that was used towards the end of the First World War.
And the British also developed fighters that could fly off of battleships, cruisers, even floats towed behind destroyers.
But at the end of the war, when British Naval Air became part of the Royal Air Force, things changed.
The RAF was interested primarily in strategic bombing, and this destroyed most of the progress the British had made in naval aviation up until World War I through the war.
In 1919, the U.S. took the lead in naval aviation with the first transatlantic crossing by air. The NC-4 flying boat, built by aviation pioneer Glenn Curtiss, took 19 days and 4 legs to make the trip. It was a spectacular introduction to naval aviation's interwar years.
Major development during the period of the end of World War I and the start of World War II was indisputably the development of the aircraft carrier.
In 1922, the U.S. Navy commissioned its first flat top, the Langley. Built on a coal ship's hull, the vessel was nicknamed the Covered Wagon. The Langley was an invaluable floating lab for carrier operations. Her arresting gear worked so well, it became standard equipment on the carriers of every nation. The evolution of the carrier coincided with improvements in aircraft.
During the 20s and 30s, the major advances in aviation were better engines, provided reliable long-range flights, monoplane, single-wing aircraft, metal construction, the U.S. and Japan going for heavier armament in aircraft.
Japan was becoming America's chief rival in naval aviation.
The Japanese, during the periods between the wars, were, like all of us, constrained by the Washington Naval Treaty that was supposed to limit warfare. Japanese were very industrious, though, and they managed to develop quite a fleet.
It had developed its carrier aviation in parallel with that of the British and the Americans during the First World War, and it now saw itself as being the major player in the Pacific Ocean.
We then see on the eve of World War II, the U.S., the Japanese, both having large carrier forces, 6, 8 carriers, building more, developing very good aircraft and very well-trained, dedicated naval aviators.
In 1938, some well-trained, dedicated U.S. naval aviators conducted a prophetic experiment. Flying from their carrier decks at dawn, they arrived unopposed at the target site and declared their attack exercise a great success. Their target, Pearl Harbor.
Naval aviation will continue in a moment here on A&E.
December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Pearl Harbor confirmed what advocates of naval aviation have been saying for years. That an effective naval air force, by effective I mean modern aircraft, good weapons, and well-trained crews, could destroy any ship on the surface of the water. Pearl Harbor gave a lot of ammunition to the advocates of naval aviation.
I ask the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The U.S. immediately mobilized for the war effort, and building a strong naval air corps was a top priority.
Increase our production rate of airplanes so rapidly that in this year, 1942, we shall produce 60,000 planes. This includes 45,000 combat planes.
The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was the first fighter that we had in World War II of any significance. And it proved to be a very tough and versatile aircraft. And we were very fortunate that we had it, because had we not had it, we would have had nothing to fight the Japanese with.
Well, the Wildcat was a spunky little fighter. Fortunately, it could take a lot of damage from bullets that the Japanese planes couldn't stand. Now, it didn't have the speed that the Zeros had, and therefore we ran into trouble when we first encountered the Zero. We tried to fight it as best we could with our less maneuverable and less speedy aircraft, and the reason we survived so well and did so well against the Zero was because we did put in self-sealing gas tanks, armor plate in our aircraft.
But the armor plating's weight put the Wildcat at a disadvantage against Japan's lighter, faster Zero fighter. To compensate for this, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch devised a weaving tactic. Teams of 2 Wildcats would fly parallel courses until one was attacked. Then each Wildcat would bank steeply inward. Thatch reasoned that such a move would throw the Zero pilot's aim off, thus making him vulnerable to attack by the other Wildcat. The Thatch weave became standard practice of U.S. fighter pilots.
Even with the Wildcat, we were very badly outclassed by its counterpart, the Zero, and I think we saw that very, very quickly, and that led to the development of its successor, the F-6F Hellcat.
Meet the Hellcat, the F-6F, a single-engine, semi-low-wing combat airplane equipped for use on Navy aircraft carriers or as a land-based fighter.
When we first got the Hellcat, it was an awful big airplane. We'd been used to smaller fighter airplanes. It was a larger airplane. Although we originally found out it was a very forgiving airplane, it became known as the ensign's airplane. It was just a safe airplane to fly. It came from the Arn Works at Grumman, and it had self-sealing tanks, it had armor plate, and the armament went up to 650 calibers, which we'd been used to 1 and 2 before in the fighters.
Over the long haulage, it turned out to be a very, very valuable aircraft for naval aviation. Shot down over 75% of all the aircraft shot down by Navy pilots during World War II.
By the time the Hellcat was introduced, the Japanese Navy had scored impressive victories in the Pacific and threatened to dominate the region. The stage was set for a major showdown in the Coral Sea.
The idea the Japanese had was to move round the east coast of the island of New Guinea to attack Port Moresby, which is now the capital of Papua New Guinea, to make a beachhead there from where to threaten Australia.
The Battle of Coral Sea took place on the early days of May 1942. It was really the first engagement that our aircraft carriers had against the Japanese of any significance. It was the first battle also where the major combatants never made contact except by air.
For young Ensign Adams, the Coral Sea was his initiation into combat.
We knew that it was going to be a big thing, and we realized that it was we get them or they'll get us business, and we were miles apart, 115, 120, 30 miles apart. Being in combat, it was quite exhilarating, something that we looked forward to, and yet when it happened, shook us up just a little bit.
In tactical terms, it was a failure and it was a disaster for the US Navy. They lost a major aircraft carrier in exchange for only a small, light, very old Japanese aircraft carrier. It was a success from the Allied point of view in strategic terms because it stopped the Japanese advance. Until that time, the Japanese had been advancing on all fronts. That was the first brake put upon their expansionism.
Coral Sea is historic. It meant that no longer could ships defend themselves unless they had carriers with them, both to do reconnaissance and to send up defending fighters and to send up bombers to attack the opposing ships. Naval warfare changed not at Pearl Harbor, but at Coral Sea in May of 1942.
Naval aviation will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Within weeks after the Battle of the Coral Sea, an important breakthrough occurred.
The American Navy had managed to break the Imperial Japanese Naval Code, so it knew exactly what was going on. It knew that a major operation was planned, probably against the island of Midway, and therefore it was prepared for action.
The capture of Midway, an American military outpost in the Central Pacific, would serve two key Japanese objectives.
Midway operation by the Japanese was designed to establish a foothold in the Hawaiian island chain from which to control the Pacific.
Secondly, by attacking Midway, they hoped to lure out of Pearl Harbor our last remaining ships.
Midway was to each of us pilots the big thing, because we were briefed the night before that this was it, guys. Everybody knew that their neck was sticking out and they had to do everything they could to defeat the Japanese at Midway.
Admiral Nimitz, the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, very astutely sends out the three carriers he has into a waiting position and uses land-based aircraft from Midway to try to find the Japanese. We know they're coming, we know when they're coming, we do not know their exact location. Once the Japanese are sighted, the Japanese are launching their aircraft to attack Midway. Japanese commander Admiral Nagumo, who led the Pearl Harbor attack, sent half of his airplanes to bomb Midway in preparation for an amphibious landing. The other half are sitting on the flight decks, ready with torpedoes and bombs to attack any U.S. ships that come out of Pearl Harbor. The planes that attacked Midway signal back, we need more bombers here. Defenses are much stronger than we thought. Just then, Nagumo gets word that we may have carriers in the area. He's shocked. At that moment, our three carriers send 4 squadrons of dive bombers against his 4 carriers. Within a couple of hours, 3 Japanese carriers are sunk. The 4th is sinking. You could say the Battle of Midway, that one carrier engagement, turned around the Pacific War.
One U.S. plane in particular made the difference at Midway.
The Dauntless was the only aircraft during the Battle of Midway that scored any hits against the Japanese fleet, even though over 98 sorties been flown against the Japanese up until the time the Dauntless got involved in that battle.
The Dauntless was a beautiful dive bomber. The Dauntless flew straight down almost as nicely as it flew straight and level. You could put a bomb down the smokestack if you really wanted to.
The Dauntless, the Navy's main dive bomber, was one of the few carrier-based planes not inferior to its Japanese counterpart. Called the workhorse of the Pacific, its wings had unique features.
It was the only airplane that had those kind of flaps, split flaps with the holes in the eye. It stabilized the dive. It made you almost as steady going straight down as going straight and level.
Another plane featured at Midway was the Avenger.
The Avenger, I think it's interesting to know, came into being immediately after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and they named it Avenger to highlight that. It came into use in the Navy the first time at the Battle of Midway. Unfortunately, it was a rather unauspicious start because all of them were shot down, but it went on to become the primary Navy bomber and torpedo plane.
I had a little over 2 hours in the plane before I went aboard the carrier the first time, so it had to be reasonably easy to operate and fly, and we were just thrilled to death to have the Avenger.
The Battle of Midway was perhaps the greatest event in U.S. naval aviation history.
The moment that it switched from the Japanese on the offensive to the Japanese on the defensive for the rest of the war was that afternoon, a couple of 100 miles north of Midway, when several squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers.
It did certainly mark the beginning of the end of Japanese naval power, and that was all through naval aviation.
In June 1944, the last major naval air battle between Japan and the U.S. took place in the Philippine Sea. It was known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
The Marianas Turkey Shoot is perhaps a classic example of how naval aviation can work at sea. Aircraft with the same capability as land-based aircraft could be carried at sea and could fight a battle many miles from land and win. And really, Japanese naval aviation was decimated in the Marianas Turkey Shoot.
They lost nearly 1,300 aircraft during that battle over a few days. They never really recovered from that battle, and that was essentially the end of the Japanese offensive capability as far as carrier aviation was concerned.
In desperation, the Japanese resorted to a most extreme tactic, the kamikaze attack.
Aircraft topped up with fuel and bombs were flown by their pilots deliberately at warships in order to try and sink or disable the American Navy. The Japanese High Command had discovered that there was no way they were going to win a war with the Americans on equal terms.
While the Japanese were self-destructing, the U.S. introduced perhaps its finest fighter plane of the war.
Corsair, I guess you might call a Cadillac of fighter planes for the Navy. It was produced in very large numbers, and it was very, very effective against the Japanese in the Pacific. The Corsair had this distinction of having the highest kill ratio against the Japanese during World War II, 11 to 1.
Flying the Corsair was a wonderful experience, considering that it was really a high-performance aircraft. It was the first fighter, to my knowledge, to be put into production, which would exceed 400 miles an hour in level flight.
Among the Corsair's unique features was its bent wing and big propeller.
Somebody said they put a bird's wings upside down. The idea was to raise the propeller so you could get a great big propeller. In other words, you raise the engine up by putting the wings down below. And swung a big 14-foot prop and go like hell.
The surrender of Japan in 1945 brought an end to naval aviation's most dynamic and historic years.
I think you would have to say that the war in the Pacific was sort of made for carrier aviation, and we'll probably never see that type of evolution again. As a matter of fact, never have.
Naval aviation will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Following World War II, the Navy quickly demobilized. Having participated in some of the most famous sea battles, the fleet was reduced from 99 flat tops to only 15. Most of them sold off as scrap metal. The number of aircraft was cut by 2/3. Many were mothballed in the desert, some dumped in the ocean. Manpower was downsized to a mere quarter of its wartime high of 431,000 enlisted men. The immediate post-war period was characterized by new challenges. Some, like the introduction of the jet engine, were anticipated. Others, like the Korean War, were not.
Very quickly after World War II, the age of the propeller-driven aircraft was coming to an end, and the Navy had to adapt to that if it expected to survive as a viable force as far as carrier aviation was concerned. That meant the development of equipment that could handle the jet aircraft and the development of the jet aircraft itself.
Initially, there's a great amount of difficulty in operating jet aircraft from aircraft carriers. Acceleration rates of those new jet aircraft are very slow, and they're very fast on landing. So slow acceleration, fast landing, very bad for carrier environment.
And then came the Korean War.
Nobody really expected it, nor were we honestly very well prepared for it. I guess no one was.
Suddenly, aircraft carriers are needed because they permit us to put fighters and light attack aircraft over North Korea.
The war required improvements in carriers and aircraft.
What we see then are the development of better aircraft engines, in part driven by the Navy requirements, catapults that within 200 feet can take an aircraft on a flight deck from standing still to perhaps 100, 115, 120 miles an hour.
Until these advances could be fully implemented, the Navy relied on a World War II standby, the Corsair.
We spent most of our time doing interdiction fighter-bomber work, and we didn't get involved in mixing it up with the MiGs. The jets were doing that at the time.
As U.S. naval aviation moved into the jet age, aircraft like the Panther became the standard fighter of the day.
By today's standards, it had very, very poor capability, but I know the people that flew it during the war, during the Korean War, I thought a great deal of it.
Probably the most unique thing that the Panther had going for it was its sturdiness. Grumman built the Panther, and Grumman is famous for its strong airplanes. The Panther was what we would call a high-density airplane for that time, but even with that, it could take a lot of damage, a lot of hits, and survive. As a matter of fact, I hit the ground in Korea one time in a Panther, and skipped back up in the air and flew back to the ship and landed uneventfully. The worst thing about it was that I really got eaten out by our maintenance chief.
This aircraft allowed the Americans to develop their jet operations at sea from aircraft carriers and gave them an aircraft capable of fighting land-based aircraft on equal terms.
We were the first group to carry armament on a jet into combat, bombs that is. We carried rockets, everybody carried rockets, but they'd never used bombs off the jet. And myself and one other pilot were the first two off with bombs aboard for our strike on Korea.
The major role that these aircraft had from the aircraft carriers offshore was to support the Army on land, to attack ground targets, railway marshalling yards, bridges, troop concentrations, rather than to act as fleet air defense, because in effect, North Korea very rarely attacked the aircraft carriers or the ships at sea.
Korea proved to be a different kind of war for naval aviation.
Well, the Korean War was a controlled war, if you want to call it that. We had certain targets we couldn't hit. We had certain targets we could hit. There wasn't too much air combat except up in the northern section. It was a war that, well, it really wasn't a war, it was an engagement, let's put it that way.
Nevertheless, the conflict in Korea was an introduction to naval aviation's role in future years.
The Korean War demonstrated that, one, we will be fighting countries other than the Soviet Union. Limited wars which will require lots of tactical aircraft, fighters, attack planes. Secondly, that these wars will be fought in areas where the United States does not have land bases readily available. Hence, carriers can bring large numbers of fighters and attack aircraft into the area.
These lessons of Korea became the reality of Vietnam.
It was like the Korean War, very far removed in terms of our effort from World War II. There's very little threat to our ships or to our aircraft, for that matter, in terms of other air forces involvement. And most of our effort was devoted to the interdiction of lines of communications and logistics.
But in one crucial way, Vietnam was very different from Korea.
It was pretty much a political war, as everybody understands, and there were a large number of political considerations that went into the way that it was fought.
The armed forces were limited in their objectives. They weren't allowed to go and win the military conflict. They had to do it within restrictions and within limits.
When they draw a line on the ground and say you can't cross there, you know the bad guys are there, and you can't go across it because it's against the rules of the day, that's not the way to fight a war.
Most of the aviators involved would have felt that we could have terminated it a lot quicker and with a great deal more honor.
In spite of these constraints, naval aviators served with distinction, flying aircraft such as the Crusader.
One of the axioms of fighter pilots is speed is life. The Crusader, or the Satyr, was a tremendous aircraft to stay fast. It had a good engine, it had real streamlining, and if you ever got below 450 knots, you weren't fast enough. It's a great combat aircraft from a fighter standpoint, and it also is a great in the supporting roles of flak suppressor or as a MiG cap, where you're going out and trying to keep MiGs out of the target area while the bombers do the job. When this aircraft was developed in 1955 on its maiden flight, it went supersonic. It was also the first production aircraft to go 1,000 miles an hour.
It had the greatest kill ratio of air-to-air combat kills during the early part of Vietnam until the F-4 really got to be developed and came into its own.
The F-4 Phantom, unquestionably the world's best fighter aircraft of the 1960s. The Phantom was a carrier-based aircraft. Could land aboard a carrier with the resting gear bringing it to a halt within 350 feet, could be launched off of a 200-foot catapult track.
The F-4's best characteristics were its power and speed, and the afterburners that the F-4 has gave it extra power that up to that time had not been available in other airplanes. It could carry quite a load of ordnance, including missiles, both heat-seeking and radar missiles, and it also carried quite a bomb load. And in fact, it carried a good array of bombs. And even though it was built for the Navy, the Air Force soon saw the merits of it, and the Air Force actually acquired more F-4s than the Navy and Marine Corps did over the lifespan of the airplane.
Flying such advanced aircraft into combat definitely took some getting used to.
There's an interesting psychological phenomenon, I think, that takes place, and that is you're in this air-conditioned cockpit, breathing 100% oxygen in a fairly comfortable environment, and so there's a sense of isolation from what's actually happening out there until somebody starts shooting at you. Then all of a sudden, there's a quantum shift in this attitude from a benign office environment, so to speak, to one of those guys are trying to kill me.
Though U.S. involvement in Vietnam will always spark debate, one thing is certain.
The people that I served with were dedicated to the country and dedicated to the principles that we were serving in Vietnam, notwithstanding the political battles that were going on in the States, that we knew we had a job to do, and we were going to do it the very best that we knew how.
Naval aviation will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The Persian Gulf, 1991.
Naval aviation was very successful in the Gulf War. Navy fighter and attack aircraft, very effective in striking targets.
One of those aircraft, the F-14 Tomcat.
The F-14 is a two-crewman, two-engine, dual-engine fighter air superiority aircraft. Its main mission is to protect the airspace to make sure that the strike package can get through.
The F-14 is considered the ultimate fighter plane.
It's the ultimate because it has a tremendous thrust-to-weight ratio. The plane can really move. It can outperform most other fighter aircraft that are much smaller. Part of the reason is the F-14 wings sweep forward and back automatically as the pilot maneuvers the aircraft. A computer senses what he's doing with the controls and the movement of the aircraft and automatically adjusts the wings to reflect the best angle for that type of maneuver. Obviously, as he slows down, the wings extend. As he speeds up, they go in. But they also change during turns and other maneuvers just to give him a little bit more edge. It carries a Phoenix missile, which also has a range now of about 100 miles.
The plane's two-man crew consists of the pilot and the radar intercept officer.
My particular role as a radar intercept officer in the F-14 is basically navigation, weapon systems operation, communications, and some other classified things that we do in the back cockpit.
It's the collaboration between the two men that makes the F-14 one of the most potent weapons.
My particular pilot's call sign was Monster, and he and I had a real good relationship, and that's really necessary once you get into combat because you need to know what that particular person is expecting from you and what you can expect from that particular person. My first experience with combat in Desert Storm was definitely the most exciting experience that I've ever had. It was an adrenaline pump that I never would have had in any other way. Imagine a roller coaster ride with the added excitement that you know your life is on the line. Somebody's actually shooting at you, and this is really it.
The Desert Storm could have been the F-14's last combat duty.
The big problem is the aircraft is expensive, and under current plans, it will be phased out of the Navy inventory early in the next century, and it will be replaced by the FA-18s.
The FA-18 made its combat debut in Desert Storm.
Well, the F-18 provides us a unique opportunity to fill several roles. We are primarily carrying ordnance across into Iraq to military targets. Bomb damage assessment that we've brought back from our strikes indicate that the airplane is truly accurate from virtually any altitude. Its agility and its computer systems just make it a dream in combat. And I think we've validated the strike fighter concept, the multi-role aircraft being able to do a little of everything.
In an F-18, there is two buttons that are, one's labeled air-to-ground and one's labeled air-to-air. And all it takes is if you have bombs and missiles on your plane and you press the air-to-ground button, then you get symbology to be a bomber pilot. And it just takes pressing the air-to-air button and you get up symbology to launch your air-to-air missiles. I flew 10 combat missions in Iraq.
and there was a good smattering of all the different types of missions that an F-18 can do. I launched air-launched decoys on one mission. I launched anti-radiation missiles. I dropped bombs. I was fighter protection for other bombers. So I got pretty much everything that the F-18 can do.
Unfortunately, compared to the F-14, does not have the radar capability, the missile capability, or the all-weather capability. But in the current budget environment, I don't see any alternative but to go to all F-18s for the fighter role in the future.
And what is the future of naval aviation?
We're probably in a very cloudy crystal ball arena right now as to what not only is the Navy going to look like, but what is the military. First, we have to get to a national strategy before we know what the military should look like.
As it stands right now, they're talking of 12 carriers, which if we can hold there, I think that would be a nice base. If they go below that, it's going to get critical.
The bigger picture of naval aviation, it's here to stay, basically. There's no question about that. It's such a quick response with the capability to take a ship, put it where you want to, or just keep it floating around out, say, in the Mediterranean, and react to any kind of circumstance that may arise. I think I'm sitting in a good place to continue my career, and it may be in a smaller service, but I think it'll be in a capable one flying the jet, so I think I got a job for a while.
It's a great challenge to guys that want to be naval aviators. It's a great thing, but it's going to be tough from the future.
While naval aviation's future is still being determined, there can be no doubt that the naval aviator has always been a unique breed.
He has to be a good pilot, a good tactician, and a good fighter. So we're talking, in the US Navy particularly, about the cream of their professional officer corps.
If you're talking about what makes a naval aviator a little above and beyond is the fact that naval aviators are associated with operating on carriers. And that, to a lot of people, is a scary concept.
An F-18 catch shot with a full bomb load, our gross weight's around 48,000 pounds, and the catapult stroke's about 230 feet long. We're accelerated from 0 to about 170 knots, which is 195 miles an hour, just about 2.3 seconds. And it's just about 5 Gs of acceleration. It slams you back in your seat, put your head back. They say cages your eyeballs until you get through with the end of the catapult stroke, and away you go.
Landing, taking off from a very small platform at sea on a wide variety of conditions can be rather intimidating.
Landing aboard an aircraft carrier in an F-18, our approach speeds are about 135 knots, about 155 miles an hour. We land in about 215 feet. It's about a 4G deceleration and throws your head and shoulders forward into your shoulder strap. It's all over in about 2 seconds.
It can be intimidating to those of us who have done it, too, and it's I think it's a mark of excellence that not everybody is given the opportunity to explore, and that's what, in my estimation, makes naval aviation very, very special.
But as complex as carrier takeoffs and landings are, even they become routine after a while. So maybe it's something else that makes the naval aviator special.
The naval aviator, I think, has a unique character because when you're aboard a carrier, you're a very cloistered community. You're more interdependent on the people with whom you're flying and with whom you're living.
It's the camaraderie, I think, that keeps them as a nice, tight unit, thinking that they are the greatest.
It's just a great pleasure to have been a naval aviator, and I tell you, I'd do it over again if I could.
I will give you this guarantee right up front. When you get through with this program, it'll be the proudest day of your life. You're going to come away as changed individuals. You're going to come away as naval officers with a sense of direction, a sense of pride and enthusiasm that can't be beat. It's great to have you as a part of naval aviation. Welcome aboard. Carry on.
Yes, sir! In spite of defense budget cutbacks and almost daily changes in the global political arena, the mobility and versatility of naval aviation guarantees its future, even if its specific role is still to be determined. For as long as there are trouble spots that require military action, a president's first question will always be, is there a carrier in the area? And the answer to that question inevitably provides naval aviation with another chance to demonstrate its power and effectiveness.
From political outcast to the savior of Western civilization, he became a larger-than-life legend. Churchill, an American television event, Tuesday here on A&E.